This is Basic, the Atari 8-bit podcast.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-bit podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. This is the 8th in a series of episodes featuring the kids of Atari's Youth Advisory Board. In 1983, Atari formed its Youth Advisory Board, selecting teenagers from around the United States to share their opinions about computers and video games, test software, and promote Atari's computers at events. The group consisted of kids aged 14 through 18, including Steve Cohen. Steve attended George Washington High School in Denver, Colorado, where his teacher, Dr. Irwin Hoffman, taught. George Washington High School received a grant from the Atari Institute for Educational Action Research, Atari's educational support arm. The Atari Institute Newsletter, fall 1982, wrote, "High school students in a model math and computer program will use their grant of Atari Home Computer systems to develop individual and group research projects in their own fields of interest. Extensible programming languages, such as Forth, will be used to develop new syntax for use in other high school subjects, electronics, music, art, history, mathematics, and home economics. This project supports a major model school known for its innovations in computer education over the last 20 years. This interview took place on May 21st, 2020.
I was always a beyond average student. I guess math and science came easy for me, and I didn't even realize how easy. It was always easy for me. So then I was fortunate enough to go to a high school that had a teacher who, it turns out, was one of the first teachers at the high school level in the United States to teach computers. Apparently it had started as a club. He had a computer club previously, and then by the time I was in high school, he had a class. It was an elective in computers, and this is right around the time that the Apple II Plus was invented. So home computers were, I think that was the first home computer. And the Atari, speaking of Atari, there were the video games and all the Pizza Huts and everything. So I signed up for this computer class, and my teacher, Dr. Hoffman, Irwin Hoffman, got a phone call one day from, I guess, the Atari people who said they were going to put together a group of 20 high school students around the country to come advise Atari about their computers. And did he have a student he could recommend? And he recommended me and put me on the phone with this lady who ran the thing, and she told me about it, and I said sure. And that's how I got on the Youth Advisory Board. I was always my teacher. I was lucky, and it was just my local high school. Maybe my parents picked that neighborhood because they knew it was a good school, but for me it was just a regular class I took, and the teacher thought I was the best student to recommend for this thing. So that's how I got on it.
Nice. And you were in Denver at the time, is that right?
In Denver, yes.
Yeah.
He was, I guess he was famous in certain circles for having been one of the first high school teachers to teach computers, and he was a big advocate for his students.
So what happened once you talked to the lady and you were on the board?
Well, then they flew us all out to Sunnyvale or somewhere in California, and we met, and it was all very heady. I mean, as a high school student, getting picked to be one of 20 high school students in the country to go do this thing for a big corporation, it was a huge a big ego booster. It was very heady. It made you feel sort of important. We get there, and there were some famous people. There was an actor. If you're doing this podcast, you probably remember his name.
There were two actors. There was Todd Bridges from Different Strokes.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
And I don't know who the other one?
The other one was Matthew Labortreau, who was on Little House on the Prairie and Whiz Kids.
Oh, I don't think I ever watched those, so maybe that's why it didn't stick in my memory as much.
Maybe that's for the best.
So the one who was on Different Strokes, I remember he was on there, and there was a kid who I think his dad owned a sports team. So there were people who got picked for apparently different reasons. And Atari, the basic premise, I guess, was they wanted the advice of teenagers to advise them on what people were looking for in a computer. Because this was early in the days of personal home computers, and at the time there were several different companies all making computers, none of which were compatible with each other.
Right.
It's before IBM entered the fray with the PC and quickly became the ubiquitous common computer, even though, in my opinion, it was the worst one on the market at the time. They had the best advertising campaign and name recognition among the general public, so they took over. But at the time, there was Apple and Commodore and Atari and a thing called Vector Graphics and Compaq and who knows how many other companies all trying to make home computers. And Atari wanted the advice of teenagers on what is it that people are looking for, what are things we can do. I don't remember specifically what questions they asked, but I know they wanted our input on it. The meeting itself, that first one, I don't remember how many days. It was several days, though. In addition to answering some questions for them and trying some, I vaguely remember we tried some products and gave our opinions about them. We got taken on a lot of tours and listened to some lectures by famous people. The thing that most stands out to me, that I most remember from it, if you remember the movie Wrath of Khan, the second Star Trek movie, we had a speaker who was talking about how computers are going to change the world and the future of computers. And specifically, he talked about video graphics and the scene where the Genesis planet gets created. And they do this, he did a whole talk on how they used computer programming to create the images of flying by it as the torpedo lands and the valleys and mountains get formed, and then you see this fire spreading around the whole planet, and then it all turns green. So the scene in that movie was all computer-generated graphics, and he talked about how computers were going to be the future of movie making. And then there was another thing. We toured a facility. It was Industrial Light and Magic, where we saw people who were working on having video cameras watch a person's movement and then making computer-generated images based on that would be used in future animation. So at the time, it was very early in the computer era, and some of this stuff was almost science fiction, and we got to see the people who were first implementing it. And, now we have, CGI is so common, it's an abbreviation, but we got to meet the people who were first inventing it, or who first came up with the idea. So what sticks with me is the tours they took us on and seeing all these interesting things. I think the first time I ever saw a computer mouse in use was at that Atari Youth Advisory Board thing.
Wow.
I'm not 100%. I might be confusing memories from around the same time. They took us touring sort of what was futuristic computer stuff. And that's what I most remember about it. I don't actually remember what advice we gave Atari. I know they asked us questions and wanted our advice on things.
I mean, for any kid, that would have been the dream to go to Atari and ask questions and do the tours and stuff.
Well, it was a dream. Yeah, that's what my memories of the time are more emotional than intellectual, if that makes sense. I mean,
Sure.
It was like, because now I'm 53 and it's a whole different life. But at the time, it was like, wow, this is special and I'm special. And it was a very, like I say, a heady time. Also, it was an era. Another thing about that time is early in the computer industry, at least as a teenager, you heard stories about like just some high school student wrote Pac-Man.
Right.
I don't know the person, and I don't know 100% that that's actually true, but that's the story I heard. And so it was, as a teenager, it was like a whole new thing. And if you had the inclination and the free time and the brain, you could do a lot of really cool stuff. I mean, I had a few other projects I did in high school with computers that did not happen to involve Atari. It was mostly on an Apple and one on a Commodore 64 and things with different computer languages, which don't even exist anymore.
What kind of projects were you doing?
One, I wrote a computer program to graph any function, which now people have graphing calculators, for a few dollars. But back then it was such a thing didn't exist. And I wrote a program that you could type in any y equals whatever, and it would draw it on a graph. And then some school district somewhere actually bought the program, and that district used Commodore 64 instead of Apple. So then I had to rewrite the program to run on a Commodore 64 because, no computers were compatible with each other back then. So I had to learn a whole nother computer. So I learned the Apple, the Atari, the Commodore, and then whatever, it was this vector graphics is the first one they had in my high school class when I first started high school. But I wrote this program and it got published. It didn't sell a ton of copies, but some school district somewhere in New York apparently bought it. So I got some check for royalties. And again, being a high school student, that was like, wow, I'm really special and this is really cool.
Sure.
Because the average high school student went to classes and went home and played and whatever. And here I was having a computer program published. And I also wrote a textbook on a computer language called Forth, which I did for my high school teacher because he got interested in this. Dr. Hoffman heard about this new language and decided he wanted us to learn this computer language, and I was the first student in the class to learn it. So he wanted me to write up some stuff to help the other kids learn it, and that turned into a pamphlet, and then that turned into a manual, and then that turned into a whole textbook, and that actually got a contract to be published, but then it never did get published because I think between when I got the contract signed and when it was supposed to be published, that computer language became unpopular or whatever reason. But
the thing you wrote was called Using Fig Forth on the Atari 800. It was 82 pages. And
you know all about this.
Yes, I was going to ask you about it.
More about it than I do. It was for the Atari 800 specifically.
Yeah.
I did not even remember that.
And it was using the Fig Forth released by Atari Program Exchange. And it's it's a really nice manual. I mean, considering, I mean, it's good. I mean, I wouldn't have guessed it was written by a high school student.
You've read the book I wrote? It never got published?
Yeah, I've got a copy right here.
How did you get that? You are amazing at tracking these things down.
I will send you a link so you can reread your
Holy cow.
thing from May 2nd, 1983.
You've read my book that I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I thought it was really cool that I had a contract to publish a book, a textbook.
Who was going to publish it? Do you remember?
Never did. I don't even remember the name of the publisher, but I wrote it and I had a signed contract, and then it never got published. I guess it got buried, like the stories of presidential accusers get buried or something. I don't know. They bought it and never published it, but I thought it was so cool, and it was. So that was for the Atari. That's a link to Atari. Maybe I knew I had done something more with Atari in high school. I just didn't remember. Yeah, maybe that.
Memory's so amazing. You wrote an entire book and didn't remember what computer it was on. Memory is just so fickle.
I remember it was about the language more than about the computer. The computers were not compatible with each other back then, but the book was more about the computer language, as I recall, than about the particular computer.
Sure. So were you?
Because if there were a version of Forth on other computers, it probably would. Well, anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, it might have been mostly compatible. So were you big into programming, or were you a gamer? How did you?
No, I was a programmer.
Yeah.
And Dr. Hoffman, he was this real promoter, advocate of computers and of teaching kids to use them, like I say, before anybody else was. My first real paying job was programming computers that he got the U.S. government got a grant for my high school, George Washington High School, to hire several students to write software that would teach English as a second language.
Okay.
And by today's standards, it was certainly very primitive. And while I was paid and thought it was really cool to have a job programming computers, it was like minimum wage, but it was a job and it was computer programming. And I just thought that was so cool. Nevertheless, I never thought that the software itself was very awesome. I thought any decent teacher would be better than this computer program. Maybe I was spoiled by having had great teachers all through school, because now, in retrospect, with the looking back 30 years later, computers have advanced to the point where my own kids, I think, learn as much or more from computers than they do in the classroom often. At least that's what they tell me. But back then, when the computer programs were very simple and basic, I never fully bought into the idea that a computer would be better than a teacher. So even though I was paid to do this, I never fully believed in it. But anyway, that's an aside. Yeah, I was not a huge gamer. I mean, back then the games were also, it was text-based. There was some game, I forget what it was called, where it was sort of like Dungeons and Dragons. You're exploring around and you tell it, I turn left, and it tells you what you see. And I wasn't huge into it. I mean, everybody back then, there was Pong, that was Atari, and then there was the next generation after Pong was things like Space Invaders, where you can move left and right, and the things you're shooting at are moving left and right or up and down. And then Asteroids, that was a huge advance because you had motion in any direction. That's how I see the evolution of gaming back then. It was how much motion you had and how the computer could I mean, Asteroids was just the greatest. That was my favorite.
Sure.
So,
A few more questions about your trip. Did they send you out there by yourself, or did you have a chaperone?
no, I went by myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think they met me at the airport and drove me around and stuff. I know that, but I did not go with any family member or anybody else on the plane, as far as I remember.
Okay. So you mentioned they talked about the Wrath of Khan movie, but I believe they took you to see a movie. Do you remember what movie you saw?
The Outsiders.
The Outsiders. Let's look that up. See if that was a Warner movie.
Does it have a scene with a switchblade knife or something?
I don't know the movie,
There's a scene
actually.
like that in The Outsiders, and that was it. But they took us to see a movie. I don't remember if there was any purpose to that as far as computers, other than...
No, I think it was just a fun outing. So of all the people I've interviewed, you're the only person who can remember the movie. It was a Warner Communications movie, so I will allow it. That's probably the movie you saw. Yeah.
Okay.
It was, I don't know, just it's funny no one could remember the movie except you, The Outsiders. Good job. So did you make any friends when you were out at Atari? Any other kids?
Not that I kept in touch with. No, not really.
Okay. Did you take any other trips? For instance, Consumer Electronics Show?
Yes. There was a Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago,
mm-hmm.
and it wasn't the whole board. It was just some of us, and I don't know why I was lucky enough to be picked to be one of those, or what major purpose we served there other than being real PR for Atari, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So you were just hanging out in the Atari booth mostly, or what?
Yes. Hanging out. What I remember from it, we went to a dinner at the original Pizzeria Uno or something before it was a national chain, and it was the most famous pizzeria in Chicago. And we went to the Science Museum in Chicago, and that's what I remember. And going and hanging out in the booth and seeing all the electronics for sale and stuff. It was actually a little overwhelming for me as a high school student because I wasn't really sure. My recollection of it, I wasn't that clear on what exactly I was supposed to be doing there. Frankly, I mean, to be honest.
Sure.
It was another, this is cool. I think it was somehow we were, I mean, you know, as a high school student, understanding the purpose of a consumer electronics show was a bit over my head.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand who attends these things, why are they there. I know there was an Atari booth, and we were there and helping to show off Atari things, I guess. But it was the things away from the show itself I remember more, like the dinner and the trip to the museum.
Yeah.
Did they have other trips too?
No, those are the only
two.
You
know more about this than I do.
Those are the only two that I know about. You did all the trips as far as I can tell. The board didn't actually last very long. It was really about a year, maybe a year and a half, with only the two meetings. And then Atari started to fall apart, and they decided to spend their money in other ways. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole computer industry changed when IBM entered the picture, which must have been around then because I think the PC came out my senior year of high school-ish, and it was just, I don't know, I can't say enough negative about it.
No, I get it. It was like super uninteresting compared to...
There were all these other computers that were so much better, and it was this big unwieldy box that was slow and didn't do much, and it was just not as good a computer as the Atari or the other computers I had used. And yet, because they had these ads with Charlie Chaplin making cakes and the conveyor belt goes wild, and then he buys an IBM PC, and then his company is making cakes and he's making lots of money selling cakes. and nothing about what the computer itself does, just the fact he bought one and now his business is successful.
Right.
It became the standard computer worldwide. And then they trademarked the term PC, which up until then had meant any personal computer. And IBM ended up, they took a word everybody else was already using and trademarked it to mean their own.
Right.
Which was a pretty brilliant marketing move. But then the PC compatible became the standard and everybody else went bankrupt. And I guess Atari quit making computers along with everybody else.
Yeah.
Even Apple almost went bankrupt after that.
Yeah. Atari gave you a 1200 XL computer, I believe.
That's probably what I must have used to do that stuff on Fourth.
Cool.
Now that you've mentioned it, I didn't remember that. I remember that they gave me a computer and a modem, and that was the first modem I ever used. I remember the modem because you had to hold the phone up to this speaker thing, and then it would dial, and you could talk to people. Yeah, so they must have given all of us a computer.
Right. They were going to, the plan, and I don't know how far this plan actually got, but the plan was that there was going to be like a BBS or something that the Youth Advisory Board kids could dial into and talk amongst themselves and then write reviews of products or something.
I don't know what VBS stands for.
A bulletin board system, like a thing you dial into with a modem.
Well, yeah, there must have been a plan like that, and maybe we did it once or twice, because I do remember having the modem. It was this big bulky thing that you set your telephone handset into. Because in my computer class, we never used modems. I mean, the internet didn't exist. Even when I was in college, just toward the end of my college, people started using the internet for email. The World Wide Web and using surfing didn't even really get going till after I finished college. So they gave us a computer. That was nice of them, especially if they wanted us to review things on that computer. But I don't remember a whole lot about it, unless maybe some of the games I played were on it. I don't specifically remember that because I had another computer in my house by then, an Apple. So, and a Commodore. I had to get a Commodore when the school district, I don't know where in New York, wanted me to rewrite my program so it would run on Commodores. I had to buy a Commodore 64 and learn how to program it. Or maybe they gave it to me too, I don't remember. So it wasn't my only computer. So maybe if that had been my only computer, that would have been more special to me. But
sure.
They also gave, I think they gave a bunch of computers to my school, because I know my computer lab went from being a small room to a huge room while I was in high school. And I think a lot of those additional computers were Ataris. I wouldn't swear, but I believe that was the case.
That sounds plausible, for sure. I found an article in Enter magazine, May 1984, that quotes you. It's about the Youth Advisory Board, but they quoted you kind of a lot. It says, Stephen Cohen doesn't believe in pulling punches. When the 16-year-old from Denver was named to Atari's Youth Advisory Board last year, he didn't want to just sit back and listen. He wanted to have some real impact. If Atari wanted a bunch of kids to sit around and compliment them, says Steve, they didn't get that from us. And then later it says, perhaps the most productive parts of the two-day meeting were the 3-hour brainstorming sessions. The first day, says Steve Cohen, we talked about what a computer should do. The next day, we were asked about what we thought of Atari products. Computers are a way to make a living, says Steve Cohen, but it's not my biggest interest. I'm not sure about what I'd like to be yet. Maybe a physicist. Which gets me to my next question. Did you become a physicist? What do you do today?
I did not become a physicist, but I did not become a computer programmer either. I went through a lot of metamorphoses. The natural thing would have been to become first of all, it's cool you found that article. I have no recollection of that interview or that whatever magazine or whatever it is you just quoted me from, but that is cool. But I went to college, ended up going to Stanford, which might have been influenced by being near where Atari was, or Sunnyvale, because actually it has to do with a math test I took. During that advisory board first meeting, there was a national math competition that happened, and I had to leave the meeting for an hour or two, or I don't know how long, and do this test. And it was at a high school right across the street from Stanford that I took it. Probably was involved in my choosing Stanford over MIT, where I probably would have gone and been a physicist or a computer or artificial intelligence person. And I always wanted to be a scientist, and I went through several majors: physics, math, chemistry. I ended up majoring in chemistry, and then I started a PhD program in biochemistry at Harvard, and then I dropped out after a year and traveled the world, and I ended up becoming a medical doctor, of all things. And I was that until about a year and a half ago. And a year and a half ago, I hit a wall of burnout, and now I work in the scrap metal business, of all things, which is what my family has been in for 3 generations. And when I quit medicine, well, actually what happened, my brother called me and said he wondered if I would consider quitting medicine to come work in the family business, and I was pretty ready to quit medicine by then, although I enjoyed that as a career for a long time. And then the next obvious question, at least to me, is why would you go from computer programming and physics to something like medicine or chemistry or anything biological? And frankly, it was this weird sense that computers were, I thought if a high school student can excel this much in the computer world, then it can't possibly be that special. So it's sort of backwards, or maybe backfired, how much really cool stuff I did at such a young age in the computer world led me to conclude that if I can do it, at this age, then by the time I'm middle-aged, how special will I be? There will be thousands or millions of people who can do this. So I wanted to do something that was more unusual, or took a more special, higher education. And at the time, I thought physics was the highest science. Then in college, I came to the conclusion that if I became a physicist, physics ultimately is always used in the defense industry, and I didn't want to do that. Then I decided to become a chemist, and then I don't know, I didn't like working in a lab, and that led me to end up becoming a medical doctor, which is I never in my life would have thought I wanted to be, but that's what I did for my career for almost 30 years.
So it sounds like yeah.
Coming back to my computer teacher from high school, Irwin Hoffman, who was a great man. He was the one who influenced me so much in a lot of ways, got me on the Youth Advisory Board. And then when I finished medical school, you have to have somebody who has a doctorate has to put something on your gown, hood. Maybe it's they put a hood over your gown as part of this ceremony. And so I contacted him he had a PhD in math, which counted as a doctorate. And so he ended up doing my hooding ceremony when I finished medical school. I haven't seen him since then, but.
Oh, how lovely.
Yeah. Wow, you got me talking a lot more than I thought I would.
Good. So tell me something, surprise me with something that the layperson wouldn't know about the scrap metal industry. What would
The scrap metal industry. There are a lot more different kinds of metal of specific kinds of metal than I would have ever guessed. You know, you think there's aluminum and that's it, but there's like 30 different kinds of aluminum, or I don't even know how many. I've only been in this business for a year now, and I don't really know it that well. I'm just beginning to learn it. I'm just at this point, I'm just one office person in a company of 55 employees, so I'm just starting to learn it. But things get shipped all over the world. Scrap metal is a commodity, not a trash. I guess that's the most basic thing. You think of scrap as like people get it out of the trash, but companies that make things out of metal, what they have left over is actually a saleable commodity. And most of the companies know that. So we have to compete to go buy it from them to then resell. I guess the surprising thing.
Good to know.
Going back to computers, that was another of my first jobs. Because of my experience in high school, my dad, when I was still in high school or between high school and college, I wrote the software for the family business that was used for their accounting for many years because I knew how to do computers, and that was that. So you do this thing on Atari.
Yeah.
And you're interviewing all of us. How many of us have you found?
Of the Youth Advisory Board people, there were of the 20 Youth Advisory Board members, I've interviewed 9 now, including you. 5 I got no response from. 3 said they weren't interested. 1 is dead, but I talked to his family.
Oh.
And 3, I never got their names. They were never could find their names anywhere. So, yeah.
Wow. You must have done quite a bit of detective research to get all this information.
Yes, sir.
Because Stephen Cohen was the most common boy name, I think, the year I was born. And Cohen is an extremely common surname. And you tracked me down in Tucson, and I wasn't actually going to respond because I thought, it's so long ago. How will I even remember, and why does it matter? And then you found my phone number, and that is persistence. And now you've read the book I wrote that I didn't even remember. It was about Atari.
It's a little stalkery. I'm sorry.
That's pretty impressive, I have to say. Wow.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of last things. I'm almost done with you. I'll let you go. If you could send a message to the people who still love their Atari computers, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
Oh, that's a hard one, because I would have to say I'm in awe of you for being able to maintain that. I don't even know where you how do you keep the floppy disk drive still working or whatever? How do you even, things in the modern world, things don't last that long. I don't know how you can.
True. Most of us aren't using floppy drives anymore. We have gadgets that have SD cards that the Atari thinks is a floppy drive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I would, if I had a message to send to people who still use and love their Atari computers, I would say kudos to you. It's not something I've ever thought about, probably like you never thought about the scrap metal business. But now that I'm thinking about it, what comes to mind is people who like old cars and keep them running, like people who keep a Model T Ford running or whatever. I'm sort of in awe that you can keep your Atari computers running and doing useful or interesting things. So I'm in awe of you. That would be my message.
All right. Great. Thank you. Last question from that article again. Whatever career Steve and his fellow board members decide on, it's certain that their experience as Atari Youth Advisors will have an impact on them. True or false? Did it have an impact on you, or is it just, yeah?
No, it did. What did it? The greater lessons I learned from being on the Youth Advisory Board, the life lessons, had to do with dreaming big and networking and knowing people.
Sure.
Because we all, at least me, I don't know, again, I don't know how everybody got picked for the board, but myself and I assume at least most of the members of the board who weren't famous people were picked because of some proficiency in programming computers or something having to do with that. And a lot of people can program a computer, or at least, relatively a lot, but who made the big things? How were they able to do the Industrial Light and Magic special effects? Somebody came up with the ideas that, we'll be able to use computers to create all these fancy graphics, or we'll be able to use computers to do whatever, simulation of biological situations. In the long run, it took having the vision and organizing a lot of people to do that, rather than just one person sitting in a room doing it by themselves. So it's the interplay, people talking to each other and exchanging ideas. The importance of that, I think, probably had an influence on future, no matter what career you go into or what path you do. Because like I said, I didn't end up becoming a computer programmer in the long run, but the importance of interpersonal interactions for success in life, that one took me a long time to really learn, but the Youth Advisory Board, I think, helped with that.
Great. Good
Does that
answer.
answer that?
It does.
Sort of?
Great. Thank you so much, Steve.
My pleasure. Thank you. Good luck with your rest of your project.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.